Hello there, football fans. Football, like in pretty much all sports, has many comparisons. For example, in basketball, we often hear about LeBron versus Jordan, P.S. Jordan better. In hockey, Crosby versus Ovechkin, P.S. Crosby better. Or in baseball, performance-enhancing drugs versus natural enhancements. But regardless, the position I think we all know that draws the most comparisons in the game of football is quarterback. And the debate I've heard as far back as I can remember is Marino versus Elway. I was born the same year they were both drafted. In this video, we compare the two head-to-head in this two-part series, year by year. Will it truly settle who's better? Probably not, but maybe it will. Who knows? It's all up to you to add your own context. But all I know is, I'm gonna have fun with this one. Of course, the story begins with the 1983 NFL Draft. To this day, arguably not only the most infamous draft in NFL history, but turned out to be one of the most famous drafts in sports history. And a matter of fact, many people say it laid the groundwork for the NFL Draft becoming the big spectacle it is today. It was the year of the quarterback, and at the forefront primarily was John Elway, the number one prospect. Others, such as Tony Eason, Ken O'Brien, Todd Blackledge, Jim Kelly, and of course, Dan Marino, were all taken first round. I highly recommend watching the ESPN documentary From Elway to Marino to get the whole story on that draft alone. But of course, the first overall pick was to the Baltimore Colts, in which Elway had voiced that he did not want to play for due to issues with the team and their ownership, and judging the shape of the franchise, you can see why. And their status in the city of Baltimore was not exactly solid, despite Irsay lying his ass off. Marino was taking 27th, that's second to last, in the first round. Many teams had considered him, but passed up on him for various reasons. Again, watch that ESPN 30 for 30 documentary. But the Dolphins needed a star quarterback, and they took, of course, Dan Marino. Eventually, Elway would be traded to the Denver Broncos. Both men were entering different worlds. Elway was joining a Broncos team that had missed the playoffs for 3 seasons straight, and coming off an abysmal 2-7 season that, of course, was the strike-shortened year. The Miami Dolphins, however, were the defending AFC champions, losing the Super Bowl to the Washington Redskins. On week 1 of the season, Dan Marino sat out, while David Woodley took Miami at the helm, coming off the starting of the Super Bowl, of course, picking up a win over their division rivals, the Buffalo Bills. The Broncos were taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers, who still had many remnants from their legendary steel curtain defense, and Elway got his chance. And on his first start, Elway felt the impact, going just 1 for 8, throwing an interception and being sacked 4 times, before the game was handed over to Steve DeBerg. The Broncos still won, however, 14-10. Elway and DeBerg split the duties in a Week 2 game, a big one in Baltimore. Elway was mercilessly booed by the Memorial Stadium crowd. He was again sacked 3 times, but fared slightly better this time, completing 9 passes out of 21. But was sacked 3 times, making it 7 in 2 games. But again, the Broncos won 17-10. While the Dolphins also went 2-0 with a win over their division rivals, the New England Patriots, but again, Woodley played the whole game. Elway finally threw his first touchdown pass in Week 3 against Philadelphia, a 33-yard pass to Rick Peros, which tied the game 10-10. But they would end up losing by a field goal, and Elway still had his problems with his offensive line, and he was sacked another 3 times, making it 10 in 3 games. He also threw 2 picks. But the big story was that Marino saw his first game of action. The Dolphins did start Woodley in a game against a stacked Los Angeles Raiders team. The Dolphins were down 27-0 in the 4th quarter. Coach Don Shula took Woodley out of the game, and Marino saw action, and he performed pretty well, completing 11 passes, throwing his first career touchdown pass, a 6-yard pass to Joe Rose, and another to a man who'd become one of his favorite targets in this era, Mark Duper, despite Miami still losing 27-14. The next week, Elway and DeBerg were both sacked endlessly, as it was their turn to drop a loss to the Raiders, while Woodley was back in action. Miami's win over the Chiefs. Elway was the most sacked QB in the league by Week 5, seeing very limited action and not playing very well, as the Broncos fell to 2-3, dropping their 3rd straight loss, this one to the powerful Bears defense. While Marino again came in relief of Woodley, played well, but the Dolphins lost 17-10 to the Saints. In Week 6, however, Elway sat out during Denver's 26-14 win over lowly Houston. But now Marino was getting his big shot, his first career start on October 9th, 1983, against, again, division rivals, the Buffalo Bills, who were one of the more improved teams in the league that year. He was looking sharp, but he did throw 2 interceptions in the game and was sacked 3 times. In and the Dolphins trailed 14-7 at halftime. Marino bombed a pass 63 yards to Mark Duper and began a comeback. The teams continued to trade touchdowns, and it was 21-21 after 3 quarters. After going down a touchdown, Marino tossed 2 more touchdowns to give the Dolphins the lead, but the Bills tied it, and the Bills would win by a field goal in overtime. A heartbreaking loss in his first start, but showing what he has to offer gave Miami fans a deeper glimpse into what was ahead. 19 of 29, a huge 322 yards and 3 touchdown passes and 2 picks. While Elway continued to warm the bench, Marino was able to get his first win of the season in a 32-14 win over another division rival, the New York Jets, throwing another 3 touchdown passes and no interceptions. He continued to roll in a 21-7 win over the Colts, and then a 30-14 win over the Rams. He was rolling on this winning streak as it reached 4 games with the 2017 win, defeating Joe Montana in their first meeting against one another. On this 4-game streak, Marino started all games and was on fire. 855 yards passing, completing 57.4% of his passes, an incredible 9 touchdown passes, and just 1 interception. The only action Elway had seen this time was a brief and unspectacular showing against the Seahawks in Week 10. But the Broncos had a 6-4 record and were still in playoff contention. Week 11 was not good for either player. Marino threw 23 incompletions and no touchdowns and a pick in a loss to New England. Elway started a game against the Raiders, and while the score was much closer, he threw 20 incompletions, no touchdowns, and an interception. But the Dolphins again went back on a hot streak, this time 5 games. A 37-0 win over the Colts in Week 12, where Elway sat out again that week. A 3-touchdown performance from Marino against the Bengals on his Monday Night Football debut. That week, Elway threw 3 picks in a loss to San Diego. Bit of a rough game, nearly being upset by lowly Houston, but they were still able to get the win. Marino sat out the remaining 2 games as the Dolphins dominated the AFC East and again won their division. But now back to Elway. Entering Week 14, the Broncos were 7-6 and clinging to their playoff hopes. Despite a bad outing against the San Diego Chargers the week prior, Elway was called upon to take on the Cleveland Browns, who were also battling for playoff contention. This was an important game at home, and at long last, Elway delivered. 60-24 passing, 284 yards, and 2 touchdown passes, and the Broncos win 27-6. Their playoff hopes alive and well, and they can now clinch one of the wild card spots for the playoffs in a win against the Colts. It might feel pretty sweet for the Colts to beat the man that demanded to be traded from them and dampen his playoff hopes. Elway was getting pulverized once again. The weak Denver offensive line allowed him to be sacked 5 times and hit several more. He didn't throw any interceptions per se, but he threw tons of incompletions. The Broncos found themselves down 19-0. Elway shook off the exhaustion and the pain and starred. First, a touchdown to Clint Simpson from 21 yards out. Then, a 26-yard touchdown to Jesse Miles. And finally, a late touchdown, a 26-yard pass to Gerald Wilhite. Elway's first comeback win in the 4th quarter, playing the best game he had all year, and showing the abilities that he could have in the clutch. The Broncos were headed to the playoffs. It wasn't an easy rookie year for Elway, but in the end, he got the Broncos where they needed to be and thrived under the biggest pressure he'd faced in his young career. Sadly, however, Elway would play terribly the next weekend, throwing 4 interceptions against the Chiefs in a 48-17 loss. But it didn't matter, as they had the playoffs to prepare for. But that was the question, as Denver took on Seattle in a wild-card playoff game. Seattle had a very talented quarterback of their own in David Craig, star receiver Steve Largent, who had his 5th 1,000-yard season, and rookie sensation Kurt Warner, at running back, who ran for over 1,400 yards. But who do the Broncos start? Do they go with Elway or the veteran Steve DeBerg, who had just returned to the lineup after a shoulder injury? They went with DeBerg, and he played well. He was 14 of 19 with a touchdown, but also 3 interceptions, but Seattle was in control most of the game. Elway eventually made his playoff debut later in the game, and he was nothing really extraordinary going for him, but it was 10 for 15 with 123 yards and no touchdowns and a pick, as Denver would lose 31-7 and their season was over. It wasn't much of an upset, as Seattle was just basically a favored team and better that year. The Seahawks win over the Broncos meant they'd have to face the Dolphins, and Marino would be the one to get the start as the defending AFC champs were the favorites going in. The Dolphins led 13-7 at the half, and by the fourth quarter, Seattle was up 17-13. Marino had also thrown some costly picks in the game, but they got the lead back 20-17. But Seattle took full control and won the game 27-20. Both Elway and Marino fall victim to the Seahawks. David Craig becomes one of the few quarterbacks to say that he beat Elway and Marino in the playoffs. Marino was 15-25 for 193 yards and 2 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. Not a spectacular playoff debut for the rookie quarterback. Marino had an outstanding rookie year, led all rookies in passing yardage, completion percentage, overall completions, touchdowns, and get this, came in second in Rookie of the Year voting, losing to Eric Dickerson, and third in MVP voting. He obtained his first Pro Bowl selection as well. And speaking of third, he was third in the whole league with a 96.0 passer rating. He had arrived. As for Elway, he didn't have the easiest year as a rookie, and had a lot of mediocre and outright bad outings. But his triumphant comeback win against the Colts to help the Broncos clinch the playoffs definitely set the tone for things to come. So it's safe to say Dan Marino wins 1983, despite 5 quarterbacks being chosen before him. Well, he blew them all out of the water. Going into 1984, Don Shula was 110% sure that Marino is his guy going forward, and the fans agreed. However, the jury was still out on John Elway in Denver, but be that as it may, Coach Dan Reeves believed that Elway was his guy going forward. Despite the Dolphins' playoff heartbreak, they were still an odds-on favorite to do very well this season, whereas the Broncos were shrouded in uncertainty. Marino plays the best game of his career at that point to open the season, as the Dolphins down the Redskins 35-17. He only threw 7 incompletions and 5 touchdown passes, as the Dolphins are off to a great start. Unfortunately, it's not the same for Elway, as he is pulled in a game where the team did obtain a 2017 victory over the Bengals. Elway didn't see much action when the Broncos the next week were decimated by the Bears, and Marino helps the Dolphins secure another victory over the Bills. Marino only threw 9 incompletions in a Week 3 win over the Bills, while Elway played a decent game in a victory over the Browns. The Dolphins continue to roll, and Marino plays great in a 44-7 win over the Colts, while Elway is not playing great. But the Denver running game from Sammy Winder and their defense is keeping them going as they shut out the Chiefs 21-0. Dan Marino is having an epic season, and the pundits and experts are truly taking notice. The Dolphins are a runaway freight train of success. His psychological game is what gives him an advantage to boot, it seems, over any given defense. And another huge performance over the Cardinals has people already touting Marino as MVP. Elway is not having nearly the same season, but the Broncos are still doing well as they beat the defending Super Bowl champion Raiders. Marino and the Dolphins continue to roll in dominant fashion with wins over the Steelers, Oilers, and Patriots. The latter of the 3, he threw 4 touchdowns, while the Broncos also win their next 3, and Elway's playing pretty decently. Marino continues to pull off his magic in a win as the Dolphins are undefeated. The Broncos are ruling the AFC West, however. Only Gary Kubiak gets to start this time, and another win for them as well. Week 10 is huge for both quarterbacks. First, Dan Marino, in a road game against the Jets. He once again tosses for over 400 yards and throws 2 touchdowns. He already has 29 on the year. The record is 36 from former Giants quarterback Y.A. Tittle, set in 1963, as the sports media is now tailing him on this record. Elway plays perhaps one of the best games of his young career so far, when he threw 315 yards and 3 touchdowns and pulled off more fourth-quarter heroics like he did the year prior, when he tied the game on a 5-yard pass to Butch Johnson, and a fumble return later won the game for the Broncos. Both teams won again the following week. The Dolphins' hot streak, however, came to an end after an exciting showdown between Marino and the great Dan Fouts of the Chargers, and the Dolphins dropped an overtime loss. And despite the close game, Fouts was dominant QB in that outing, and it was one of the highest-rated football games on TV that year. Elway had an epic day, however. He didn't throw many pass attempts, just 19, but only threw 3 incompletions and 5 touchdowns in a win over the Vikings, as the Broncos and Dolphins are tied for the best records in the league. The following week, the Broncos winning streak ended, however, in a tight loss against the Seahawks. But on Monday Night Football, despite throwing for a small 192 yards, the Dolphins still beat the Jets, and Marino still tossed 4 touchdowns. He has now tied Y.A. Tittle's record of 36 touchdowns in a year, and receives a standing ovation from the fans in attendance, as he will certainly break the record. It's an absolute shootout between the Dolphins and the Raiders, and Marino breaks the record with a 4-yard pass to Jimmy Cavallo, which tied the game in the first quarter. The home crowd in Miami gives their hero a standing ovation. Marino was truly becoming ingrained in Miami popular culture with his heroics and great play. And despite racking up a career-high 470 yards passing in the game as well, the Dolphins do, however, drop a loss. While in the same week, the Broncos dropped their second straight. Marino had another 400-yard, 4-touchdown game the next week as the Dolphins won their 13th game of the year. The Broncos got back on winning track as well. But going into the final game of the season with his record 44 touchdowns, Marino also had 4,744 yards on the year, closing in on the record set by Dan Fouts in 1981 of 4,802. And the stage is set for Monday Night Football as the Dolphins down the Dallas Cowboys 28-21, and Dan Marino not only breaks the single-season passing yard records, but becomes the first quarterback in NFL history to reach 5,000 yards passing. What a way to end the season. Marino has truly had a one-of-a-kind year that very few can say they've duplicated. Thus ended an epic season for Dan Marino, and to this day is still deemed one of the best single seasons in the history of the NFL. It's pretty hard to argue that, but the test is coming for both he and Elway, who had a decent year but not a great one. Both teams won their respective divisions, and awaiting the Dolphins were the team that upset them last year, the Seattle Seahawks. Only this time the Dolphins take apart the Seahawks, who are without star running back Kurt Warner. And I said stop that! And the Dolphins take it 31-10, the first playoff win of Marino's career. He performs very well, and his team is off to the AFC Championship. And Marino could be potentially meeting his counterpart John Elway in the Conference Championship, as the very next day it'll be the Broncos hosting the Steelers in the other AFC divisional battle. The Broncos had a 17-10 lead in the third quarter, but let it slip. Elway couldn't get the ball moving, and they lost 24-17 as he threw 18 incompletions and 2 interceptions and was sacked 4 times. The battle was not meant to be, sadly, but the show goes on for the Dolphins. There's no stopping Marino as they face the Steelers in the AFC Championship. While the glory days may be gone, the Steelers still have one of the best defenses in the league, and they'll need it. The Steelers had a 14-10 lead early, but Marino went to work, and what a game he played, as the Dolphins, for the second time in 3 seasons, are headed to the Super Bowl. After a 45-28 win, he completes 21 of 32 passes for 421 yards, and oh yes, 4 touchdowns. And it will be a showdown between 2 men who will become icons in their respective positions of quarterback. As awaiting Marino and the Dolphins were Joe Montana and the San Francisco 49ers for Super Bowl 19. Marino was seen as the big star to take the reins in pro football going forward. Montana already had a Super Bowl ring to his credit back in 1981, but he still wasn't getting the respect he deserved. But diehard football fans and, well, pretty much everyone in San Francisco knew how good he was, and they all knew everywhere around the league that this was a battle of 2 elite athletes in their respective positions. And the Dolphins actually led 10-7 after the first quarter. Montana and Marino were performing very well, but in the second quarter, Big Joe took over, as did the San Francisco defense. Sadly, even the greatest quarterback sometimes needs a great running game, especially in this era. Miami did not have that. San Fran outrushed the Dolphins 211-25, and Montana also outplayed Marino, and our hero did throw several incompletions as well as 2 very costly interceptions and was sacked 4 times. Sadly, it was not the night for Marino and the Dolphins, as the 49ers just had way too much depth on both sides of the ball and won the big game. It was a heartbreaking end to an outstanding season, but regardless, Marino still has plenty to be proud of. Dan Marino, as I stated, had what is still considered to this day one of the all-time great seasons from a quarterback in NFL history, setting records for passing yards and touchdowns that stood for many years. To the surprise of literally nobody, was a league MVP and Offensive Player of the Year that year. He made his second Pro Bowl and was named first-team All-Pro. He won the AFC Championship and started Super Bowl 19 despite a losing effort. As for Elway, he improved over his rookie seasons, but still had a way to go. But he had a huge 5-touchdown game and did help lead the Broncos to a first-place finish. Be that as it may, however, it is not all on him. They suffered badly in the playoffs, as the team was still trying to build around him, but they relied more on their running game and defense. So needless to say, Marino wins the year. So now going into 1985, both men faced pressure for a different reason. Marino had to follow up one of the greatest years ever, while Elway had to prove he was among the elite, and now he had very much improved offensive line in front of him. Both men started the season quite badly, as Marino played poorly and the Dolphins actually lost to one of the annual laughingstocks of the NFL, the Houston Oilers. He was even pulled from the game and outplayed by Warren Moon. Elway didn't have a stellar first week, throwing 20 incompletions, but did throw 2 TD passes in a loss against the Rams. Both men, however, bounced back in week 2, as Elway threw for 4 touchdowns for the Broncos, and Marino threw for 329 yards in their team's respective wins over the Saints and Colts. They both continued to roll through week 3, but the game many were waiting for took place on September 29th, 1985. We would truly see Marino versus Elway. It would take place at Mile High Stadium in Denver. For the two QBs, it was probably just another game they set out to win like, well, any other early in the season. But for die-hard football fans and for the experts and pundits, this was something they wanted to see since the 1983 draft. The Broncos got out to a good start, and their running game was something they had a huge advantage over the Dolphins with. And it worked early on as Gene Lang ran the ball 10 yards out to give the Broncos an early lead. But Dangerous Dan went to work with a 69-yard pass and run play to Nat Moore that tied the game. In the second quarter, Miami took the lead with a field goal, but Denver's running game came back as Sammy Winder helped them take a 14-10 lead. The Dolphins roared back with a field goal, and Marino hitting Joe Rose from 24 yards out and giving them a 2014 lead, which changed to 2017 by halftime. The Dolphins were winning the game as well as the head-to-head battle being won by Marino. But Elway did lead a drive in the third quarter that allowed Winder to get another touchdown, but a failed convert after 23-20 Broncos. But Marino continued to work his magic, a 46-yard pass to Vince Heflin for a touchdown to take a 27-23 lead. They trade field goals and Elway couldn't work his comeback magic. The Dolphins took this one 30-26. Elway mainly relied on the running game, which was pretty much, for the most part, Denver's main strategy. And to his credit, it was a back-and-forth game, which he still kept his team in until the fourth quarter. But Marino not only wins the game, but wins the battle, as he killed the Broncos on the long ball and threw 3 touchdown passes, all of which were more than 20 yards. Marino is running away with this battle as the season continued, as Denver bounced back in Week 5, and Miami continued to roll as well. But the Dolphins suffered a shocking loss against the Jets in Week 6, while Denver scraped by Indianapolis Colts, staying in Baltimore, right, with an ugly win, and would do the same next week against Seattle, while Miami won an offensive shootout with the Bucs. At the halfway point of the season, the Dolphins would drop another tough loss in an upset to Detroit, while the Broncos defeated the Chiefs in dominant fashion, but again, it was more the running game than the defense. By this point in the season, the media boo-birds came out and criticized both men for different reasons. Elway was deemed as simply a placeholder on a team that could have a strategy with quite any half-decent quarterback. It wasn't so much Marino taking the blame for the Dolphins' woes in recent upset losses, it was more so the lack of a running game. However, Marino still took a lot of brunt for incompletions in some given games. With the AFC highly competitive this year, even the Dolphins and their decent 5-3 record, however, seem so far down from Denver's 6-2. Even a team with a good record could miss the playoffs this year. Both teams and both QBs looked awful, as Denver's offensive line, which had improved over last year, had crumbled recently as Elway is owned by Dan Fouts in a loss to San Diego, while Marino played one of the worst games of his career in a loss against division rival New England. But then Marino and the Dolphins went on a tear. 7 straight wins to end the season. One of those was to the Chicago Bears in what would be their only regular season loss that year. Also a 5-touchdown performance against the Packers. Marino threw for 1,868 yards in this stretch, completing 61.1% of his passes, and threw for 16 touchdowns compared to just 9 picks. And yet again, the Dolphins are division champions. As for the Broncos, Elway would face Joe Montana for the first time in Week 10, and while the game wasn't a huge shootout, Elway actually played slightly better in the 17-16 Denver win. It's got to be a huge feather in the cap for John, as it was live on Monday Night Football. And also the very next week, against Dan Fouts and the Chargers, Elway got a win back against the legendary QB, and again played a slightly better game than his future Hall of Fame counterpart. And then in Week 12, the Broncos had a chance to take a big lead in the division over their biggest threat, the Los Angeles Raiders. Elway didn't play his best game, but tied the game late, performing more late game for heroics, but they would lose in overtime, and now had identical 8-4 records for first place in the AFC West. They recovered with a win over the Steelers, but they lost another important game to the Raiders, and now had fallen to second place. And while the Broncos finished the season with 2 more wins and 11-5 record that they had in common with 2 other wildcard teams, but due to the old common opponents and conference rules, the Jets and Pats respectively did better in that regard, and the Broncos missed the playoffs. But the Dolphins did not, and their first opponent for the AFC divisional round, the central champion Cleveland Browns. And the Dolphins actually found themselves on the verge of being victim of one of the biggest upsets in history, as they found themselves down 21-3 in the third quarter, but Marino kept them in the game, engineering a drive leading to a 6-yard pass to Nat Moore, and the Dolphins, again not known for a running game, shocked the Browns, and Ron Davenport booted 31 yards for a rushing touchdown. And with just 1:57 to play, Marino's big drive of the game led to Davenport plunging in from 1 yard out. The Dolphins came back 24-21. Their defense held them in the rest of the game, and they are off to their second straight AFC championship. It wasn't the finest game of Marino's career, but he showed up, and he still had the skills to come up in the clutch. But either way, they're just one win away from making their second straight trip and third in 4 years to the Super Bowl. In their way, another team poised to pull off an upset, the New England Patriots. Only this time, the Dolphins would be victim of an upset. Again, Marino was relied on way too much, and the Pats' ground game killed them in the end. They combined for 255 yards compared to Miami's 68. Pats quarterback Tony Eason only, threw 12 passes the whole game, but 3 of them ended up in the end zone, whereas Marino threw again 2 very costly interceptions. The Dolphins would lose 31-14. It was another heartbreaking end to a storied season for Marino and the Dolphins, as many felt the Pats' luck would run out against them. It's hard to follow up a record season, but Marino still led the league in passing yardage, touchdowns, and completions. His QB rating slipped, as did his completion average, but regardless, he was still first-team All-Pro once again, and slipped into play in the Pro Bowl, and did lead Miami to another division title. As for Elway, he continues to improve in many ways, and was only second to Marino in passing yards and completions, but sadly was also the second in the league in interceptions, and the Broncos missed the playoffs for the first time since they acquired Elway. So once again, Marino has the better year, as his career has truly skyrocketed, while Elway, he was still well on his way, but it was a slower climb. Coming into 1986, the Dolphins were eager to get back into Super Bowl contention while the Broncos were trying to figure out their next step. Marino was considered to be the most highly skilled QB in the world, above Joe Montana and just about anyone else at this point. Elway again was sadly just seen as a placeholder. Both men's opening weeks were very different. Elway led what was becoming a trademark for him, the fourth quarter comeback win over the Raiders. And while Marino played every bit as well as Dan Fouts, again, their lack of a running game got the Dolphins in a 50-28 rout, a much different start. The Broncos were off to an amazing start, winning their first 6 games. Elway threw for over 1,200 yards, completed nearly 56% of his passes, but the big stat is 11 touchdowns and just 2 interceptions. Elway had finally played the best stretch of games in his career. As for the Dolphins, they bounced back in Week 2 and in Week 3. Marino had an epic game. He threw for 6 touchdown passes in a game. Only 20 players at the time had done so. However, their defense looked rough in a 51-45 loss in that very game against the Jets, as their QB, Ken O'Brien, also had a big game in his own right. They suffered 2 more losses, and Marino was playing well, but it was the same problem. They rebounded with a win against the Bills, however, on Week 6, but they were 2-4, while the Broncos' hot start came to a halt as they lost to the Jets and Elway had a rough night. While the Dolphins, however, were rough, but Marino was still good in a loss to the Raiders. Elway looked good in a win over Seattle, while Marino and the Dolphins, desperately needing a victory, did beat the Colts. As now at the halfway point of the season, nobody expected the Dolphins to have a losing record, and the Broncos to be so dominant. The next week, Denver rolled on with a win over the Raiders, and the Dolphins rolled on with a win over lowly Houston, looking slowly to regain their winning ways. However, it again was halted the next week in a loss to the Browns, while the Broncos came out on a losing end in a very ugly game against the Chargers. The Broncos dominated the Chiefs, while the Dolphins kept their playoff hopes by a thread, beating the Bills. In Week 12, both QBs went into games with against the respective New York clubs. First off, it was the Dolphins against their rivals, the Jets, who were 10-1 going into this game, and the Broncos headed to the Big Apple to take on the Giants, both teams 9-2. The Dolphins shocked everyone, not just beating but throttling the Jets 45-3. Marino only threw 7 incompletions and had a 500 record in playoff hopes still looking somewhat probable. Their division, however, so tough, it wasn't going to come easy. Elway put up some great numbers against the Giants, but he threw a very costly pick to George Martin that was returned for a touchdown, and the Broncos had trouble finding the end zone on this day and lost 19-16. Elway and company, however, bounced back the next week with a win over the Bengals, but the Dolphins lost a key game to the Falcons, where Marino threw 4 picks. The Broncos were dominated by the Chiefs, which was bad news for the Dolphins, as that's one of the teams they were contending for a wildcard playoff spot with. But the Dolphins kept their playoff hopes on life support, avoiding a New Orleans Saints comeback. Their playoff hopes ended, however, as the Seahawks and Chiefs kept winning, with the latter getting the last playoff spot. Marino had another amazing outing in a win against the Rams, but closed out the season with a tough loss to the Pats. The Dolphins would finish 8-8, third place in the AFC East. For the first time since Marino had been drafted, and for the first time for the club since 1980, they will not be competing in the playoffs. The Broncos clinched the division with a nail-biter win over the Redskins, but didn't end the season as so great, as they were dominated by the Seahawks. Strange, as they win the AFC West with the same record they missed the playoffs with last year, 11-5. Elway was starting to prove the naysayers wrong and was having a great year, but he had yet to obtain a playoff victory. In their way in the divisional round were last year's AFC champions and this year's AFC East champions, the New England Patriots. The game was back and forth, and Elway indeed got his first playoff win, but it was running back Sammy Winder and the Broncos front line that were the biggest difference makers, but Denver was on their way to their first AFC championship since 1977. The team they'd have to meet is one very bit as good as they are, with an amazing QB of their own, Bernie Kosar. They face the Cleveland Browns. Both teams hungering for success, and it looks like the Browns could be well on their way at long last, as Kosar hit Brian Brennan with 5:43 left to play from 48 yards out to put the Browns up 20-13. Then after that, a mishandled kickoff buried the Broncos all the way down to their own 2. No way they'll get out of this one. However, Elway hit the field cool, calm, and collected with now 5:32 to go. Elway smartly hit Sammy Winder from 5 yards out to get them away from the goal line. Then Winder followed that up with a 3-yard run, and then a 2-yarder gave Denver a fresh set of downs at the 12. After Winder plunged 3 more yards, Elway took the ball himself and ran for 11 yards for another fresh set of downs. He then hit Broncos fan favorite Steve Sewell for 22 yards out to put them in midfield, as you could almost hear Browns fans getting tense. Then Elway hit Steve Watson from 18 yards out to the Cleveland 40-yard line as the 2-minute warning hit, perhaps giving the Browns some breathing room, and for Coach Marty Schottenheimer a chance to develop a defensive strategy to stop this current drive. It looked like the Browns' moment of rest helped. As play resumed, Elway threw an incompletion and was then sacked for an 8-yard loss. 3rd and 18 from near midfield. But not losing his cool or getting frustrated, Elway silenced the now lively Cleveland crowd once again with a 20-yard pass to rookie Mark Jackson for a first down at the Cleveland 28. After an incomplete pass, Elway hit Steve Sewell with a 14-yard pass as the Broncos were now in the red zone, but they only had under a minute to play. After an incompletion, Elway ran 9 yards to the 5. 3rd and 1, and rather than go for a fresh set of downs, Elway took a gamble and found Jackson in the end zone for the touchdown as Rich Carlos moved the extra point, and the game was tied with just 37 seconds to play in regulation. The teams were now out to overtime. Elway again worked his magic, a 60-yard drive that led to the game-winning field goal by Rich Carlos to send the Broncos to the Super Bowl. Elway engineered what is known to this day as simply as the drive. It has become the standard bearer for clutch playoff play in the NFL, and at last Elway was truly etching his name in NFL lore. Then came the big game, Super Bowl 21. Elway has a chance to do what Marino couldn't do in his first chance. Standing in their way were the New York Giants, who were the heavy favorites and had a very talented quarterback of their own, 1979 7th overall first-round pick, Phil Simms, who battled injuries early in his career and initially was being deemed a bust, but in the last 3 seasons he's looked pretty sharp. He's a very smart thinking man's quarterback, and in 1985 he even had a Pro Bowl appearance under his belt. The Broncos led 10-9 at the half as both teams' defenses were doing their job, and Denver couldn't get their running game going as Sammy Winder had been completely shut down on the ground. In the second half, the Giants just completely destroyed the Broncos on both sides of the ball and would win the game 39-20. Elway didn't play particularly bad. The Giants were honestly just very good at this time, with a punishing defense and Simms playing one of the most perfect games a quarterback could ever play. Dan Marino was still on fire even if his team was not. He led the league once again for the 3rd straight year in yardage, completions, and even came close to breaking his own touchdown passes record with 44, of course, best in the league. Dubiously, however, he was second in the league in interception, but also second in QB ratings, and again was a first-team All-Pro and started the Pro Bowl, but sadly, for the first time since his arrival, the Dolphins missed the playoffs. Elway had a banner year and truly etched himself among the elite in that new era, especially with the fact that he accomplished the AFC Championship win, and not to mention, he had significantly decreased his interceptions and made it to his first Pro Bowl and played in his first Super Bowl. This year pretty much told the world there was no doubt about Elway. This is a tough one, a close one, because Elway's playoff accomplishments and utilization of his running core definitely put him neck and neck with Marino. But Marino still had an outstanding year, won many awards, and he accomplished a lot with his statistics, but it's not just about statistics. So I'm going to call this one a tie. Going into 1987, Elway was no longer regarded as a placeholder and seen as one of the league's tried and true best. The Broncos were one of the preseason odds-on favorite to go all the way and win it all. The Dolphins were hoping to rebound from a disappointing 1986, even if Marino was still at his best. But at this point, both men had the woes of missing the playoffs once, and both men have now lost a Super Bowl, and they were entering their 5th season. Their identities were truly becoming ever-present. Marino had success fairly fast. Elway had to work a little harder to obtain an elite status. Elway liked to run out of the pocket and kill it on the long ball, whereas Marino was more of a thinking man's QB with amazing accuracy, short or long. Week 1, the league got underway, and Elway was superb in a 40-17 win over the Seattle Seahawks, throwing only 10 incompletions and over 300 yards, and a big 4 touchdown passes. Marino was quite the opposite. Despite throwing 3 touchdown passes, the Dolphins lost a tough game to the Patriots. The next week, it was the opposite as Marino played well in a victory over the Colts, while Elway threw 3 costly picks against underdog Green Bay, which resulted in a tie. But then something happened. The NFL players strike, and for 3 games, teams used replacement players. The Dolphins went 1-2 in those games, the Broncos actually went 2-1. But in return to action, Marino went head-to-head with star Buffalo Bills pivot Jim Kelly, who he had beaten both times they had faced last year. But this time, Kelly got the better of him for the first time, truly igniting one of the best QB rivalries of this time. Elway and the Broncos suffered a big loss on Monday Night Football to the Vikings. Both men hit big victories over the next week, and while the Dolphins continued their winning ways, the Broncos were stymied by the Bills' defense. Elway and Kelly didn't quite have the epic showdown that Marino and Kelly did. The Broncos then went on a tear. Elway was superb despite a low completion percentage. He guided the Broncos through these wins, and again has significantly turned around his interception game. While back to Marino, he looked great in a win over the Bengals, but was brutal in a shocking loss against the Colts, a team he had great success against. The Dolphins beat the Cowboys, but Marino was terrible in a shutout loss against the Bills. Their playoff hopes were dwindling, but the Dolphins began a hot streak of 3 straight games to keep their hopes alive going into the final week of the season, and Marino was his amazing self. Denver's 4-game win streak came to an end in a close game with Seattle, but the Broncos finished with 2 wins over division rivals KC and San Diego in what would be the last game of Dan Fouts' career. And they finished 10-4-1 and won the AFC West once again. There was still a wildcard spot open for the Dolphins as Seattle had clinched one, but sadly it was not to be. The Dolphins lost to Pats, and the Houston Oilers clinched their first playoff spot as a result. Miami missed the playoffs for a second straight year. But now the Broncos are off and running into the playoffs. Elway was having an incredible year, and after the Super Bowl loss from last year, the Broncos were hungry. In the AFC Divisional Playoffs, their opponent was the Houston Oilers, a team that hadn't been in the playoffs for the better part of a decade, led by their amazing quarterback, Warren Moon. However, Elway and the Broncos easily advanced the AFC Championship for the second straight year with a 34-10 victory. And awaiting them once again, the Cleveland Browns, looking to avenge last year's heartbreak, and this was another thrill ride. Late in the game, it was tied 31-31. Both teams went back and forth, but Elway found Sammy Winder in the end zone to make it 38-31 Broncos. But then Bernie Kosar was again showing his resilience with a big drive for the Browns. It was 2nd and 5 from the Denver 8. Kosar handed the ball off to Ernie Biner, the star running back. Biner looked like he was about to tie the game for his team, but suddenly, Jeremiah Castile got the ball loose. Biner fumbled, and Denver regained possession. They ran down the clock, making the Browns burn through their remaining timeouts. They conceded a safety from the punter to kill more time, and the Browns were derailed on their final drive of the game. The Broncos are headed to the Super Bowl once again. Elway gets another chance. Super Bowl 22. Awaiting the Broncos were the Washington Redskins, coached by the great Joe Gibbs. This year, the Broncos were the favorites, and despite the great team the Redskins had, many felt it was because their QB, a former Pro Bowler from Tampa Bay, Doug Williams, would just not be able to match Elway on the field. And it was looking good for the Broncos early on. Elway hit Ricky Nettle for a beautiful 56-yard touchdown play. Rich Carlos added a field goal. The Broncos led 10-0 after one, but then that would be as good as it would get. Doug Williams was on fire. The Redskins set a record with a 35-point quarter, and Williams had 4 touchdown passes, a record for a single quarter. Timmy Smith was also running over the Broncos' defense. Elway was decimated. 3 interceptions, sacked 5 times, and threw a total of 24 incompletions. Their ground game was limited. In the final, 42-10 Redskins. Elway and the gang were humiliated, and Doug Williams played the game of his life as the Broncos lose back-to-back Super Bowls. Dan Marino had another big year with stellar numbers, but didn't lead the league in the categories we were used to seeing him lead. He was still 3rd in passing average and 2nd in touchdown passes and overall completions, and had the 4th best quarterback rating. But the Dolphins do miss the playoffs for the 2nd straight year, but indeed he makes the Pro Bowl for a 5th straight time. For John Elway, however, NFL MVP. Yes, he earned the big honor at last. He was truly etched in stone as one of the best in the world at what he does. He was a 2nd-team All-Pro to boot, played in his 2nd Pro Bowl, and 2nd straight Super Bowl in a losing cause. Despite Marino putting up huge numbers, Elway gets the win for the first time this year. He was not a leader in many major statistical categories, but his commanding of his offense and clutch play were what made voters take notice for that year's MVP. It was a career year for John. (1988, to say the least, would probably be a year that both men want to forget. They each opened the year with losses and bad individual games. and Marino would actually be pulled from his game. The next week, both teams would face division rivals as the Broncos would bounce back, throttling San Diego, but the Miami offense looked absolutely pathetic against the Bills. Elway looked rough in a loss against Kansas City, but Marino was sharp in Miami's first win of the season, which was over the Packers. But both teams would lose as Miami drops a game to Indy, while Elway throws an atrocious 4 picks against the Raiders. Both men's teams had started 1-3. The Dolphins seemed to be getting worse. The Broncos were the biggest disappointment in the league. At the exact same time, both men and both teams would go on the 3-game winning streak. In wins over the Vikings, Raiders, and Chargers, Marino didn't have the Marino-type stellar numbers that we're used to, but at least got the Dolphins to a winning record at that point at 4-3. Elway in wins over the Chargers, the 49ers, where that of which he actually outplayed Joe Montana, and the Falcons, he also didn't put up overly stellar numbers, but again, the Broncos were looking a little more like themselves. Elway, however, was injured and didn't play the following week, and their streak ended, while Marino did accomplish something amazing. Even though Miami would lose 44-30 to the Jets, he became only the 4th quarterback in NFL history to pass for 500 yards in a single game. But sadly, that would be the only good thing about this game, as otherwise Miami played brutally and Marino threw 5 interceptions. And regardless, though, that's still a huge accomplishment. Marino, however, was able to carry the momentum of that big game into a win against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers next week. Elway returned, but was still battling health and inconsistency, and the Broncos were crushed by the Colts. Things were looking bad in Denver and good in Miami, but the Dolphins would soon be squished like the fish that they are. I guess I got nothing. But yes, a horrendous 5-game losing streak. And you guessed it, Miami's non-existent running game did them in. And these numbers were living proof Marino is not necessarily the problem. Receivers have also become inconsistent. The running game issue needed to be solved a long time ago, and the Miami defense had trouble against potent offenses. As for the Broncos during this time, they rebounded with 2 wins over KC and the Browns. They would be embarrassed, however, by the New Orleans Saints 42-0, and were 6-6. And Elway couldn't stay consistent as Denver was having some trouble with their running game. They now had veteran future Hall of Famer Tony Dorsett, but neither he or Sammy Winder could get it together. Despite Elway still having a steady target in Vance Johnson, the rest of the receiving corps also didn't seem to have much going for them. Elway looked sharp in a win against the Rams, but not so good against the Raiders, as they fell to 7-7 with 2 weeks to go in the season. Playoff hopes were dwindling. The Dolphins at last snapped their losing streak. Marino had a 400-yard game against the Browns, but would end the season losing to the Steelers quite handedly, and Marino ending the season as he started, getting pulled from the game. The Dolphins not only missed the playoffs for a 3rd straight year, but Marino has his first losing season and the worst of his career so far. The Broncos were in a must-win situation against Seattle in Week 15, and it wasn't even close. The Broncos lose 42-14, and while Elway does not play bad, Dave Krieg of the Seahawks plays a million times better, and the Seahawks outrun the Broncos 230-101. Elway is sacked 4 times. The Broncos ended the season with a 21-10 win over the Patriots, but the Seahawks won the division that week officially. The Broncos, after 2 straight Super Bowl appearances, were out. Dan Marino did all he could, and he led the league in both passing yardage and overall completions for the 4th time in his career. But sadly, interceptions, rarely with him, became an issue yet again. He was 2nd in the league. He also had a career-low passer rating. The Dolphins missed the playoffs, and for the first time he was not selected as a first-team All-Pro, nor did he play in the Pro Bowl. But the real problem were in the Dolphins organization were much deeper. They ran much deeper than Marino, which was pretty much the best thing they still had going for them. It wasn't much better for Elway. This was a huge step down and a far cry from his MVP season the year prior. The Broncos also have a lot of retooling to do. Both men had their troubles, but based on numbers alone, you gotta go with Marino for 1988. In 1989, Marino was looking to get the Dolphins back to being a winning club, while Elway and the Broncos were looking to overcome a highly disappointing season. Marino and the Fish opened the season against the Bills, and again Jim Kelly got the better of Marino as the Dolphins lost 27-24 at home. Whereas the Broncos started the season on a 3-game win streak against the Chiefs, Bills, and Raiders. And Elway wasn't racking up stellar numbers, however, and was having problems with interceptions. The Dolphins, after 3 games, were off to a 1-2 start. A win against the Pats and a loss against the Jets where Marino threw for over 400 yards. It wasn't looking too good. The Broncos' winning streak was halted by a loss to the Browns, while Marino was atrocious in a loss to Houston, the team now falling to 1-3. But both teams went on a 3-game win streak, as the Broncos would move to 6-1 with wins over the Chargers, the Colts, and Seahawks, and Elway's numbers got better, but still not what you'd call his best. The Dolphins downed the Browns, Bengals, and Packers, and Marino had some very good numbers, but even his winning streak didn't really display him at his best. But despite it all, after a bad start, the Dolphins were now 4-3, but we saw this last year. The Bills' running game slaughters the Dolphins, while the Broncos is a tight one to the Eagles, as both teams' streaks come to an end. But again, the theme continues for Denver with a 4-game winning streak. The Steelers, the Redskins, where Elway didn't play, and his return a dominant win over the Seattle Seahawks, where he threw 4 TD passes, and the Broncos were 10-2, and Elway was looking better as the season progressed. As for Marino, he and the Dolphins scored 3 straight wins to move to 7-4, with wins over the Colts, Jets, and Cowboys, as Marino was showcasing himself at his best once again, while the Dolphins found themselves tied for a first-place spot with the Buffalo Bills in the AFC East. However, the Dolphins were humiliated the next week and lost to the Steelers, where the Bills moved to 8-4. Both teams have 4 games to go. The Broncos would only win 1, a game where Elway would look the best he has all year in victory. But despite a bad end of the season, their 11-5 record put them comfortably in first place, winning the division and returning them to the playoffs. As for the Dolphins, they fell to 7-6, losing to KC, but went 8-6, beating the Pats. But then they were beaten by the Colts, who shared an 8-7 record with them. As a matter of fact, going into the final week of the season, the Bills, Colts, and Dolphins were all at 8-7. The Bills had the lowly Jets, so it looked like it would be easy. The Colts had the Saints, who were a decent team, and the Dolphins had the Chiefs, also a decent team. The Dolphins lost a last-second heartbreaker, losing a chance even for the wild card, as the Bills would clinch the division, as a win would have given them one of the wild card slots. As Marino played well, but it wasn't enough. 4 straight years without a playoff appearance. But the Broncos were now back in the swing of things, and awaiting them in the AFC Divisional Playoff is the Pittsburgh Steelers, still being coached by the great Chuck Noll and bolstering some good solid young talent such as QB Bubby Brister. But it was an exciting outing which saw the Steelers go up 10-0 early on and lead 17-10 at the half. They led 23-17 in the fourth quarter, but Elway again worked his magic and led the Broncos on a path to the end zone and a 24-23 win, and appearing in their 3rd AFC Championship game in 4 seasons. Elway's late game ability to come through for his team benefited them yet again. And yet again, awaiting them in the AFC Championship, the Cleveland Browns. Only this time, there was no epic drive or heartbreaking fumble, but Elway was brilliant, completing 20 of 36 passes for 385 yards and 3 touchdowns, and a 31-21 win. And the Broncos were off to their 3rd Super Bowl in 4 seasons. Would 3 times be a charm? The man Elway had to face in Super Bowl 24 was the very man that Marino was outplayed by in Super Bowl 19. That, of course, Joe Montana, aiming for his 4th Super Bowl of his career and 2nd consecutive at this point. The 49ers were the heavy favorites, but Elway was playing amazing in these playoffs, and Denver had a good defense that could certainly give the Niners a headache. The Niners, having dominated the season, were, once again, the heavy favorites. Elway and the Broncos had nothing and sometimes even less. 2 interceptions, sacked 4 times. 1,000-yard receiver Vance Johnson was being held to just 2 catches all day, and they were outrun 144-64 on the ground. And of course, Big Joe doing his thing. Elway and the Broncos walked away with a terrible loss, 55-10, which was the most dominant in Super Bowl history. The Broncos didn't seem to just lose the big one; they did it more spectacularly every time. Marino again put up stellar numbers, but it's no surprise at this point, really. He was 3rd in passing yardage, 2nd in completions, yet his percentage was a low point in his career. Also had the lowest passer rating of his career once again, and led the league in interceptions, but he did have the 3rd most passing yards in the entire decade of the 1980s. Elway was again keeping his reputation as a clutch player even in the regular season, and still a good playoff performer despite being unable to obtain a Super Bowl ring. He did lead the league in 4th quarter comeback wins yet again. Despite not being high up in other statistical categories, he did finish the decade as the 7th leading passer of the 1980s in terms of yardage. He was selected to the Pro Bowl and won his 3rd AFC Championship, and appeared in his 3rd Super Bowl in 4 seasons. This year, while Marino again was statistically superior, Elway's abilities to win even when he does not play the greatest complete game were starting to become a major trademark, and again performed well in both playoff games despite a poor performance in the Super Bowl. That again being said, the Dolphins' problems have very little to do with Marino. As I said, the decade of the 80s saw Marino finish third among the decade's leading passers in yardage, just behind fellow future Hall of Famers Dan Fouts and Joe Montana, while Elway finished seventh. That's nothing to sneeze at whatsoever. Marino's numbers were utterly insane, but his team's problems were that while he was leading the league in completions many times, he was also leading the league in pass attempts. His percentage of the completions were decreasing. Elway didn't come close to racking up the same type of numbers that Marino did in many ways, but his abilities to win games is what was etching his legacy at this point. He'd only missed the playoffs twice in his first 7 seasons, while Marino has missed 4 seasons in a row. Going into the 1990s, Elway was 30, Marino was 29. Not old in a human sense, obviously, but in the athletic sense, this is where time usually starts ticking down a little faster. The 1990 season saw the Dolphins trying to get back to playoff prominence, and the Broncos trying to finally win the big game. This was the first time bye weeks began in the NFL as well. A new era was truly dawning, as new contenders were also emerging. The new decade began well for Marino, a 27-24 win over the Pats, despite throwing 3 picks. Elway didn't look very good at all in a 14-9 loss to the Raiders to open up the season. Marino finally got the better of Jim Kelly in a win against the Bills the following week, starting off the season right while the Broncos bounced back with an exciting win over the Chiefs. Marino, however, played terribly in the team's first loss of the year against the Giants, as the Broncos continued to win with another exciting battle over Seattle, where Elway was fantastic in a thrilling overtime win over the team. For the Dolphins, it only got better. Their defense was good, and they had a bit more of a running game. And were so good, in fact, they went on, get this, a 6-game winning streak. And Dan was the man. Successive wins over the Steelers, the Jets, the Pats, the Colts, the Cardinals, and another one over the Jets. Led the Dolphins to 8-1 after 9 games. The most impressive stat, he completed just over 61% of his passes. That's the Dan we know and love. Elway and the Broncos, on the other hand, would drop 3 straight, and he was absolutely brutal, but to be fair, so was the rest of the team pretty much. The offensive line again was crumbling in many games, Vance Johnson wasn't playing all that well, and Denver's defense also let them down a couple times. The Broncos ended their losing way with a win over the Colts, and Elway looked good in the win, but they crumbled even in a bigger heap. They lost 6 straight games, the worst losing streak of Elway's career. Losses to the Vikings, the Chargers, the Bears, the Lions, oh my, the Raiders, and the Chiefs made Denver slip to 3-10. Yeah, their season's over. Elway on the streak, however, wasn't truly that awful. Their running game diminished in many ways. Their defense wasn't all that stellar, but they did add a key to their offense, a young tight end by the name of Shannon Sharp. As a matter of fact, Elway completed just over 63.5% of his passes and played very well in some games. The Broncos would finish 5-11, no playoffs. As for the Dolphins, they did lose a few, but went 4-3 to end the season and finished 12-4, but didn't win the AFC East due to the success of the Buffalo Bills, but regardless, an easy wild card berth. The Dolphins' first playoff game since the 1985 season will be a wild card playoff outing against the Kansas City Chiefs at home. It was Marino taking on veteran and former Elway teammate Steve DeBerg. It didn't look good for the Dolphins as they were down 16-3 going into the fourth quarter. The Dolphins weren't playing all that bad and the Chiefs' defense was holding them at bay. But in the fourth quarter, Marino broke out and engineered 2 huge drives and scored 2 touchdowns as the Dolphins led 17-16. But the Chiefs had one more chance. Nick Lowry, one of the best kickers in the league, could win it for them with a big 52-yarder. It went up, and it was short of the goalpost. The Dolphins win. Marino played well in the game and came up in almost the same fashion as his counterpart Elway would in this type of situation, knowing how to win an important game when the chips are down. And awaiting Marino and the Fish in the second round was the team and the QB they were all too familiar with, the Buffalo Bills and Jim Kelly. I, of course, mentioned earlier in the video that the class of 1983 was the year of the QB. 6 went in the first round. Some, like Ken O'Brien, had a pretty good career, but the only Hall of Fame pivot in that class, other than the 2 we're talking about here today, is Jim Kelly. This year, they were 1-1 against each other, but in their head-to-head showdowns, Kelly was 5-3 against Marino at this point. It was an offensive shootout to say the least, but the Bills led 20-3 in the second quarter, as the threat of Kelly through the air and Thurman Thomas on the ground was just killing the fish. The Dolphins did have a slightly better running game this year with Sammy Smith, but he was no Thurman Thomas. The Dolphins got a TD when Marino hit Mark Duper from 64 yards out to give them some momentum, but it was halted after Kelly and company drove for another score, making it 27-10. Marino called his own number for a 2-yard TD to close the gap to 27-17 at the half. Both teams traded field goals in the third, and the Bills still led by 10. But Marino got them to within 3 after hitting Ray Foster for a 2-yard grab. But Thurman, Reed, and Kelly were just too much in the end, getting 2 more TDs. The Dolphins got one back, but it was too little, too late. They lost 44-34. Kelly and Marino had a QB showdown for the ages in their first playoff battle, but like he had often, Kelly was one of the few who could outplay him on a consistent level. Marino, however, made the city of Miami cheer for their team harder than they had in quite some time, and he had a superb year. He improved on some of his numbers, third in both passing yardage and completions, but his big stat is the fact that he only threw 11 interceptions all year. He wasn't selected to the Pro Bowl, however, but regardless, could still be proud of the year well done, and no shame losing to the Bills in this era in a playoff game. It was a bizarre year for Elway. As bad as the Broncos were, he actually improved on a lot of his numbers this season. Again, showing much like Marino's 4 playoff-free years that Elway wasn't necessarily the problem in Denver. Elway didn't have a particularly bad year, but we have to give 1992 Marino leading the Dolphins on a resurgence as a playoff contender. The Broncos had their worst season since Elway had joined the team, while Marino and the Dolphins were flying high again. The Broncos were simply a team that encountered injury issues, inconsistency, but they kept their faith in Dan Reeves as their coach, while the great Don Shula still hoped to get Miami to the next level in the 1991 season. Elway and the Broncos started the season off right with a dominant win over the Cincinnati Bengals at home, and Elway looked amazing. Marino and the Dolphins also looked great, but not as great as the Bills. Kelly got the better of him again. The following week, Elway was sacked 5 times by the vicious Raiders defense, losing in the process, while the Dolphins relied on their defense to beat the Colts. The Broncos went on a 3-game win streak with victories over the Seahawks, Chargers, and Vikings, and while Elway's numbers aren't anything to get excited about, the Broncos had a really good running game that year, led by Gaston Green. Their winning streak was halted as the Broncos were eviscerated by the Houston Oilers, where the showdown between Warren Moon and John Elway took center stage, but the Oilers were the ones fighting the end zone all night in a dominant 42-14 win. The Dolphins kept going back and forth, a loss to the Lions, a win over the Packers, losing to the Jets, then beating the Patriots. Marino was looking good, but the Dolphins couldn't garner any consistent momentum, so it seemed. The Broncos made the most of their bye week and came back refreshed and went on another 3-game winning streak as we've seen in the past. The Chiefs, the Pats, and the Steelers were the ones in their way. And again, Elway's numbers look somewhat pedestrian, but his abilities to win games late is again on display. This time, however, the hot streak is halted by the Raiders in a poor performance from Elway, but at 7-3, the Broncos were a lot better than last year. As for the Dolphins, their lose one, win one start to the season at 3-3. They would then drop 2 straight to the Chiefs and Oilers, and Marino didn't play well. Denver's offensive line continued to allow Elway to get pulverized, but they still bounced back after their streak ended with a win over the Chiefs, and who were on the tail for the AFC West title, but Elway was sacked 5 times, making it 10 overall in the last 3 games, as the Broncos would lose to the Seahawks, but still stood pretty well at 8-4. But then they ended the season on a tear, and Elway was looking good despite some interception problems and still getting sacked often. But again, his ability to win tight-knit games is what made him so great to begin with, and he's doing it again. The Broncos were on top of the AFC West, back once again, a 12-4 record. After the Dolphins fell to 3-5, they came back strong with back-to-back wins over the Colts and Patriots. And Marino back on his game, but the Bills again gave the Dolphins headaches. And now Kelly was 7-3 against Marino, as the Dolphins' running game, which made strides last year, was back to square one. The Dolphins were desperate to hang on to their playoff hopes this year, but then went on a tear of their own, amassing a 3-game win streak. Wins over the Bears, the lowly Bucks, and the Bengals. Marino had insanely good numbers during this streak, including a completion percentage of nearly 63.2%. The Dolphins sat at 8-6, looking to chase that final wildcard spot in the final 2 weeks of the season. 3 spots are open as one division leader will take the 4th. 3 teams have a chance at another one. 4 were still in the hunt. All Miami needed was for the Jets to lose to the Patriots and for themselves to beat the lowly Chargers. Other factors remained, but that was the biggest. And the Jets did lose that afternoon during a 1 o'clock game to the Patriots, which means the Chiefs and Raiders automatically clinch. All the Dolphins had to do is beat San Diego, who were 3-11 entering the game, and had lost 3 straight. And it was looking to be a cinch, as the Dolphins led 23-10 at the end of 3 quarters, but the Chargers bolted to life. 3 quick touchdowns, and suddenly they lead 31-23. This collapse was truly epic, but the Dolphins still weren't eliminated. Marino hit Mark Duper for a TD to bring them back within 1. But the Dolphins were left stymied when the Chargers running back Rod Berenstein followed the right blocks and ran a 63-yard scamper for the touchdown to go up 38-30. The Dolphins were not out of the woods yet. So as luck would have it, going into the final week, the Dolphins and the Jets were to play each other. The final playoff spot on the line. If the Dolphins win, they're in simply because they'd had the better record. But if the Jets win, both teams would be 8-8. But the clincher would be that the Jets took both games against them this year. The Jets were on a 3-game losing streak, so Miami wasn't really panicking as they had home field advantage. However, the Jets came to play and were up 17-13 with a minute to go. But Marino, not faltering under pressure, drove the Dolphins and with 44 seconds left to play, putting them up 20-17, sending Joe Robbie Stadium into a frenzy. But the Jets didn't panic. Ken O'Brien drove them down the field, and with no time remaining, Raul Allegra kicked a huge 44-yard field goal to send the game into overtime. O'Brien then engineered a 63-yard drive, setting up Allegra's 30-yard field goal to eliminate the Dolphins. 1 year after rebounding, they had gone from 1 step up to about 3 back. Yeah, Marino again played pretty well, but the Jets outrushed Miami 242-37. Yet Shula still had a job somehow. Yeah, you can at me at that one for all you want, I don't care. So now it was playoff time. A new foe emerged as Elway would face Warren Moon and the Houston Oilers in the playoffs for the very first time, as Houston dominated them during their meeting this season, and Moon was outstanding in that game. Though keep in mind, Elway wasn't half bad either, as many other factors led them to lose. The Oilers went up 14-0 early, and while the Broncos got back in the game as Elway hit Vance Johnson for a touchdown, the extra point failed. They were still down 14-6. The Oilers then made it 21-6, but the Broncos stayed in it, with another touchdown to cut Houston's lead to 8 at the half. A field goal in the third drew the Broncos closer by 5, but Houston answered back and still led by 8. Greg Lewis then scored a 1-yard TD plunge, and the Broncos were down by 1. Moon and the Houston offense had been outstanding, only having to punt once. With 2:07 to play, and Denver was pinned at their own 2. Why does this sound familiar? But there's no way Elway can pull off another drive. The Broncos have no timeouts remaining this time. It's over. The stadium was nearly silent, but woke up when Elway hit Mike Young with a 22-yard pass, but didn't look good as the next 3 plays failed, and it was 4th down. Elway took a major gamble, scampering 7 yards, but again, found himself this time at 4th and 10 at his own 35 with under a minute to go. This cannot be good. But Vance Johnson was left wide open 44 yards down the field, and the place erupted, and it was down to kicker David Treadwell in the final seconds of the game to kick a 26-yarder. However, earlier in the game, he missed a convert. Earlier in the season, had a field goal block with the game on the line against the Raiders. But this time, there was no question. It's good. The Broncos are now off to the AFC Championship again, the 4th time in 6 seasons. Moon may have outplayed Elway statistically and had a great game, but again, winning is what matters. Elway could do it, and he did it once again, and it mattered in a huge way. In the AFC Championship, they had to contend with the defending AFC champions, the Buffalo Bills. Kelly and Elway had only faced each other 3 times, and Kelly had won 2 of those battles. It was a very defensive game, and they were both having a rough day. In the third quarter, the game was still scoreless. Elway kept getting sacked 3 times. He was getting pulverized by Bruce Smith and the Buffalo front line, and then he suffered a deep thigh bruise, and it limited his mobility. And with the Broncos buried deep in their own zone, Elway threw a costly interception, returned 11 yards for a touchdown to give the Bills the very first score of the game in a 7-0 lead. With Elway's injuries and problems on the field, this game was over by the fourth quarter, and the Bills went up 10-0. And Gary Kubiak in his last game played very well, getting the Broncos back in it, and they only trailed 10-7. But the clock ran out on the Broncos and were denied a trip to the Super Bowl. A rough way for the comeback season to end, but we also must keep in mind, this Bills team was incredible. Elway did play badly, but no worse than Kelly did that day either. But Kelly still won the game. Marino's year was another excellent statistical marvel, second in both passing yardage and completions, as well as fourth in touchdown passes. He was selected to his 6th Pro Bowl, and his first since the 1987 season. But sadly was left yet again carrying another heavy load, and the Dolphins missed the playoffs for the 5th time in 6 seasons. Elway again didn't really lead much in statistical categories, but he was 3rd best in games won by a starter. He also helped the Broncos rebound from a bad season. Still made many comeback wins, and they took the AFC West and made it to the AFC Championship after The Drive Part 2 against Houston. He was selected for his 4th Pro Bowl. Once again, Marino was statistically superior, but again, Elway obtaining the win is what makes him special. And another huge playoff comeback drive, that's a huge deal. I'm giving 1991 to John Elway. The Dolphins took a step back, but Denver sprung forward. However, the 1992 season would bode very different for both Elway and Marino. Both men were now in their 30s, each entering their 10th season. Neither had won a Super Bowl. Elway had been there now 3 times, Marino had been there once. Elway had been to 4 AFC championships, Marino had been there twice. Miami has now also missed the playoffs 5 out of 6 seasons, while Denver have only missed 3 in Elway's entire career so far. The Dolphins had week 1 off, but the Broncos won their first game of the year, and while it wasn't a big game from Elway as a whole, it was a fourth quarter comeback that led them to a win over the Raiders. The Broncos were also successful in their next game, beating the Chargers, but the Dolphins got out to their best start ever with Marino. The Browns, Rams, Seahawks, the Bills, the Falcons, and the Pats all fell to Miami. And to the surprise of literally nobody, Marino was on fire. Over 1,500 yards passing, 11 touchdowns, completing 61.2% of his passes. This is a hot streak for him, even by his standards. And of course I mentioned that the Dolphins beat the Bills on this streak, as Marino ends his losing woes against Jim Kelly. The Broncos are decimated, however, in their 3rd game by the Eagles, as they only held the ball for 20 minutes all game. They got back on winning track, however, with wins over Cleveland and Kansas City, as Elway, even in the wins, had been sacked 10 times combined in those games. Despite this, however, they were still 4-1. Make that 15 sacks in 3 games, as Elway was destroyed by the defending Super Bowl champion Redskins, but rebounded against Houston. But they would lose a nail-biter to the Chargers and sat at 5-3 at the halfway point. The Dolphins' big 6-game win streak was snapped with back-to-back losses to the Colts and Jets, and Marino throwing 5 picks total in those games. They would, however, avenge their loss to the Colts in a big shutout win, but Jim Kelly would avenge the Bills' loss earlier this season as the Dolphins lose their heated rivals at home. They went on to beat the Oilers, but then were beaten by the Saints and then crushed by the 49ers. They were 8-5, and fans and the media were starting to panic, as after their 6-game win streak to start the season, they've been 2-5 since. For the Broncos, panic would soon set in for them. While they took 2 wins against both New York clubs, in the latter game, Elway was hurt and was listed as week to week due to injuries. This couldn't have come at a worse time. The Broncos were 7-3 and now had to rely on rookie Tommy Maddox, and Denver's running game became weaker, whereas Miami's strangely had become stronger. Maddox went 0-4. The Broncos fell to 7-7 with their playoff hopes on life support. The Dolphins, on the other hand, shut the naysayers up and won 3 straight to end the season and clinched the playoffs, and for the first time since 1985, won first place in the AFC East, an 11-5 record. Marino was the one in the clutch, and the 2 exciting victories to end the year out of 3. The Broncos had a very slim chance to make the playoffs, but Elway returned for a game against the Seahawks to a big ovation from Denver fans. And Elway only threw 9 incompletions. Sadly, 3 of them were picks. And they moved to 8-7, however, but they still had a chance, as slim as it may be. Unfortunately, it was not to be. Elway was sacked 6 times, threw 2 picks, and the Chiefs took apart the Broncos 42-20. They'd missed the playoffs for the second time in 3 seasons. The Dolphins, however, were just beginning their playoff trek, and their opponent, a young resurgent San Diego Chargers team who had been rebuilding for years and had returned to prominence. But the Dolphins would make very easy work of San Diego, as Marino led the charge and was actually able to rely on his team's running game in a 31-0 win. The Dolphins were back in the AFC Championship for the first time since the 1985 season. But awaiting them, oh yes, Jim Kelly and the Buffalo Bills. Only this time, Miami was the host and the favorites to win. Many felt the Bills' consecutive losses in the last 2 Super Bowls meant their luck had pretty much, run out, what little luck they were having at this point. The Bills, however, took a 13-3 lead at halftime in front of a packed house of 72,000 at Joe Robbie Stadium. The fans are anticipating their team returning to the big game, as Miami's ground game, which again had made drastic improvements, was shut down by the Bills, and Marino just couldn't get the ball moving in the air enough to score any points. Jim Kelly also had trouble in the air, but the Buffalo ground game killed Miami. Once again, common theme, 176 yards to 33. The powerful Bills front court were a nightmare to deal with. The Bills led 26-3 in the fourth quarter. Marino finally found the end zone, but the game would end 29-10 Bills, who have now won their 3rd consecutive AFC championship. A lot of people thought it was Miami's time again. Hell, even me as a 9-year-old kid thought it was finally their time, but it was not to be. The Bills were still just too good at this point, and as I said, Marino and Kelly weren't all that stellar, but Kelly wins the game, and the Bills just had certain advantages and vast playoff experience. Still, Marino had a huge year, leading the league in both passing yardage and completions for the 5th time in his career, and for the first time since 1988. He was also 2nd in touchdown passes, selected to his 7th Pro Bowl, and led the Dolphins to their first AFC East title since 1985, and played in the AFC Championship game for the first time that same year. Elway, even though he missed 4 games due to injury, put up some of the absolute worst numbers of his career. The Broncos also missed the playoffs, and he was 5th in the league in interceptions, and was 3rd most sacked quarterback even after missing 4 games. He was, however, named NFL Man of the Year for his humanitarian work off the field. It's no contest that 1992 goes to Marino, as even when Elway was healthy, it was probably one of the worst years of his career. After this, 12 seasons, the Dan Reeves era in Denver had come to an end. Well, we've now covered 10 seasons of 2 of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, but neither have faced championship glory. How will it end? Find out in part 2, Elway versus Marino. Until next time, what other NFL-themed videos would you like to see? What would you like to see me cover, past or present? Hope you enjoy the upcoming NFL season. Until next time, I'll see ya.